Hi, folks. Thanks for watching my monologue. As America starts to reopen, just remember that guns, etc., never closed. They still have over 10,200 square feet of ammo, firearms, and accessories, including safes, and they remain open for business. Stop by their huge store in Mesa or just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Thanks. Welcome back. Happy May 28th, 2020. There is in this country a wonderful, a beautiful set of speeches and events in the history of our civil rights. For me, you start with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and move on to John Marshall Harlan and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy and so much more. In each of those is a volume of learning, and it's all been unlearned or forgotten. I worry more about the unlearned than the forgotten because I think it's deliberate. What is unstated here, and I think needs to be brought out, is while, yes, there are beautiful moments, speeches, testaments, acts from that history of civil rights, our history of civil rights, it goes unarticulated, unfortunately, that we needed a history and movement for civil rights. In other words, it's simply unfortunate that when we wrote in 1776 that all men are created equal, that wasn't the end of it. Would that it were. It wasn't. And part and parcel of that is that, as Thomas Jefferson put it, the law can act on the actions of the body, but not the measurements of the mind. And the human mind is corruptible, fallible, subject to prejudice. Note I said subject to it, not dominated or fixed to it. But it's only subject to prejudice by being trained to it. I think most agree there's no real evidence that people are born to divide fellow human beings by race. As the old Rodgers and Hammerstein song puts it, you have to be carefully taught. You have to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. You aren't born to hate or to judge. In fact, when you teach Jim Crow to young children today, their reaction is often enough, "You mean we used to do that? Really?" That's a good and right sentiment. But the truth is, yes, some of us, not all, not even a majority, but yes, some of us did do that. Which is why we needed a civil rights movement, perhaps as much as why we needed a civil war. But somehow to the modern left, it's as if the Civil War was lost by the Union Army, or that the Union Army didn't exist at all. We are to them an endemically and forever permanently racist people. What rot, what junk thought. And you see it again today. You have an awful, terrible, words really fail, set of behavior or behaviors from someone or some several, and it's extrapolated to cover the whole people. 1 or 4 policemen do something horrible, all America is responsible. All police are responsible. I hope one understands immediately what is going on here. A rule we are told not to live by, rightly, applied to the rest of us. The rule we are told, again, rightly, not to follow, is that one represents the whole. We call that prejudice. You know the rule. Because some people who are black cause some crimes, we cannot morally or in any other way treat every black person as a criminal or a prospective criminal. Of course. It's so obvious, it's almost weird to say it. Same with anything else, though, where it's less obvious, because one white person did X does not mean all white people did X equally. True, isn't it? But the left does live by that rule, don't you see? Because some white people owned slaves, all white people owned or were responsible for slavery. What never made any sense to me is, why do they make it so easy? Why not make it a little more difficult for the narrative? Because hundreds of thousands of white men fought for the Union and against slavery, singing, "As he died to make men holy, we shall die to make men free." Why? Because hundreds of thousands of white men lost their lives doing that. Why does that not mean that every white man did that? Why isn't that group responsibility applied? You see, prejudice only runs in one direction, and if it doesn't fulfill a narrative, it will be forgotten or untaught. So we come to Minneapolis. 4 police officers are responsible for the death of an African-American man there. That's what the video shows. That's what the writing there is all about. In a better day, we wouldn't need to see this as a racial incident. In a better day, we'd see a video of police officers responsible for the death of just another man, if you could call that a better day. But it's all wrong. Because the decedent is African American, we have to assume racism. Not just wrong and mortally wrong behavior, but racist and mortally wrong behavior. Saying this will get me in a little trouble, but it really shouldn't. I'll just say it until I ever know more. I never assume racism. I assume non-racism. But we've been trained, or one might say we've been carefully taught. I well recall the incident in 2009 when in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Police Sergeant James Crowley arrested Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates, a black man. Gates was arrested when Crowley saw him breaking into a house. It was, as it turned out, Gates's own house. Crowley was lambasted as a racist. We read and learned more, and it turned out he wasn't, and had done great work on race relations and saving many minorities. But because black, we all assumed racism. We were forced to assume, in other words, that if Crowley saw a white man breaking into a home, he would have not made the arrest. That's the junk thought we've been forced into thinking. Of course, the other way around never works. I am not 100% sure, but I think nobody has ever called O.J. Simpson a racist for killing a white woman and her male friend, who was also white. But all this right around the aftermath of what we all knew from the Rodney King incident and subsequent riots, right? It would be so much better if we didn't have this, any of it. A man kills a man, or 4 men kill a man, and it's as horrible and terrible as the most horrible and terrible thing in the world. But now we add race to it all, and it's somehow worse. As if life is cheapened or enwealthened, depending on the race of the survivor or assailant and the race of the victim or decedent. But it is now, which means we've defined murder down, or cheapened murder, so that some lives taken are worse than others. Which brings us to another part of the Minneapolis story. Also not popular, but totally true, as John Hinderocker, a Minneapolis resident, reminds, quote, "The city of Minneapolis has been governed exclusively by liberals for decades. The current mayor, Jacob Fry, who was quick to denounce his own police department, is a left-wing Democrat. The Minneapolis City Council consists of Democrats and Green Party members who think the Democrats are not radical enough. Under left-wing leadership, Minneapolis has been governed abysmally for a long time. Its police chief is but one part of an incompetently governed city, and is also, by the way, African American. Hard to say the problem is institutional with all that going on, but at least it will now all get better, I say sarcastically, as we learn Al Sharpton is heading to Minneapolis. He will unteach a lot. I say that unsarcastically. We have with us, if I can return to where I started, a beautiful, tragically beautiful history of civil rights in this country. I mentioned Robert Kennedy. On the night Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, he, Kennedy, had to break it to a mostly black audience at a rally for him in Indianapolis. They had not heard yet about King's death. He had to tell them. He did so in what is one of the most famous extemporaneous speeches in our history, saying this, quote, "In this difficult day and this difficult time for the United States, it is perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence there evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and desires for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in great polarization, black people amongst black, white people amongst white, filled with hate toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand with compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. For I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in these United States. We have to make an effort to understand and to go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He wrote, "In our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. I'll leave it there, just as I wish we could have left it in 1776, that all men are created equal. Thanks. I'm Seth Leibsohn.